Hi, my name is Jordy Izzard, and I am an Alumni Relations Officer at SAIS in Washington, D.C., and I'm here today with Sally Anderson in her lovely apartment in New York City. She graduated from SAIS in Washington, D.C. in 1964, and today's date is May 17th, 2013. And we're so happy to be with you, and just wanted to have a little bit of a conversation and maybe start with what originally brought you to SAIS.
Well, looking back on it, I think basically an interest in international studies, which increased in the summer of 1960. I took a course at American University on the United States in a changing world environment. Fell in love with it and decided after I had made a little more money at teaching school after college that I would want to go back into international studies for a master's degree. And I did a little bit of checking around, and SAIS looked wonderful.
Did you remember what it was you were, like what you were comparing it to? Or?
No, I knew I loved Washington, but just the information about SAIS and the fact it was a 2-year program looked wonderful. So in the fall of 1962,
They started there.
Started.
That's great. And tell us about, I think you mentioned you actually were on 2 different campuses, but maybe tell us a little bit about what you remember about being at SAIS.
Well, I certainly remember the 2 campuses, the little girls' school, Margaret Truman's old girls' school on Florida Avenue, and then we were the first class to enter and graduate from the new school on Massachusetts Avenue. So that was 2 totally different experiences, and it was wonderful.
Good.
But throughout, I loved the courses I took. I decided to major in African studies, mainly because my background from college had been in European history, and I felt I wanted to know something more about the non-Western world. And at that point, all these countries were becoming independent in Africa, and I thought that would be fascinating. So,
that's terrific. That's great. And what else do you remember about being at SAIS? You were there for a couple of years.
Loved the student body, too. We had a number who came actually from Bologna. We're sharing 1 year in Bologna, 1 year in Washington, which was great. And then we had some of our classmates with whom we only spent 1 year in Washington, and they went to Bologna. But it was a terrific group of people, and I had a lot of fun there too. Enjoyed it. But loved some of the coursework. Took 1 course on China that was absolutely marvelous. Another course, and when you look at the change in what's happened in the world today, on South Africa, that was taught by 4 members of South Africa, 2 who were economists, 1 who was a historian, and 1 who later became head of his college, and a black South African who could tell us more about apartheid, because they were deeply involved then. But that was a fascinating course that was offered.
That's great. And then you also mentioned several deans and I think visits from secretaries of state that you recall. Tell us a little bit about that.
I remember very often we would have times when the school could get together and they had, you know, late afternoon, whatever, people who would come in and talk to us. I always remember when Dean Atchison came, because he said, yes, he would come and talk and answer questions, but only if we had cocktails. So that was memorable. But I also remember, and this must have been probably when they dedicated the new building, that there were 3 secretaries of state present. Dean Rusk, the one currently serving at that time, was the speaker, but Christian Herter was there, and Dean Atchison as well. So that was very memorable.
That's great. That's great. And then you also remembered, I think, the day that Kennedy was shot. Tell us your memories of that.
Well, do you know, I think any of us who were alive at that time remember wherever we were. But I remember getting the news when we were in the cafeteria, and one of our classmates had been down watching television, and he came in to give us the news, and of course we all flocked down to check, you know, the news, and at that point they were pronouncing Kennedy, that he had died. And after watching for a while, we came back up to kind of reassess this knowledge, and I always was struck by the then man who was head of the language laboratory, and I believe he was from Indonesia, saying he was so struck by this, and the other time he was so struck by something in America was when he was a prisoner of war in Indonesia under the Japanese, and they had smuggled a radio in, and he heard Harry Truman as he became the first, or the president after Roosevelt had died. And also I remember it was so quiet on the streets of Washington that day. The following Sunday, I was with a friend down on Massachusetts Avenue as they were bringing the cortege with Mrs. Kennedy and the family and the body of the president to the Capitol. And someone in the crowd had a radio and announced that Oswald had just been shot. So that stands out in my memory. And then the final one, I didn't have a class the day he was buried. And I had my car, was staying, at that year, living with cousins in Virginia. And I went alone out to the cemetery to stand and watch the cortege of dignitaries who marched up the hill to the burial, and still remember seeing all the heads of state, and probably about as close as you and I are right now, de Gaulle passing by. So that whole time, you know, but those are just memories.
Very historic, yeah. That's great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And then when you graduated from SAIS, tell us a little bit about your career and how that evolved. It sounds very interesting. So,
well, career is such. Anyway, we all began looking for jobs. Yeah. And this is different given today's world where so many more opportunities, and I'll mention that later, are available to women, actually. But I had taken, as a lot of us did, the Foreign Service exam. Passed the written by the skin of my teeth, I think. Others in my classmates, I know Charlie Twining passed very well and up there. But I went for the interview, and I remember in August of that year, where the oral interview and you're quizzed on everything. And still remember, and I had already had other, you know, interviews, both in Washington and New York. But I remember sitting afterwards while the 3 men who were quizzing me for the, seemed like 2 hours, but whatever, however long it was, were debating, and then they called me in. And I can still remember some of the questions they asked. But they said, well, you did better on your oral than you did on your written. However, with your background in African studies, we cannot see a woman in Africa at this time However, if you were to marry a Foreign Service officer, that would be terrific. I wasn't offended. I didn't have my heart set on Foreign Service at all, you know. But I still remember those comments. And then later I pursued an interview that I had with the Institute of International Education in New York City, and was hired there and came up to work in October.
And were you there for how many years?
I was there almost 5 years at IIE, and ironically, nothing to do with African studies. The division I was hired in for educational exchange was in the leaders category, and I was hired particularly to help carry out a Ford Foundation program of bringing over professors and leaders from Eastern Europe, those behind the communist bloc, to meet with their counterparts in the United States. And it was a wonderful program we had.
That's terrific. Yeah, absolutely.
So
that was international.
That was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed that. And interestingly, Ford would kind of develop something, and then they'd pass it off. You know, that they had done that, you know, for so many years. So they were ending that program in 1969, just about the same time that I was planning to be married. So.
And in what year did you marry?
1969.
Okay, great. And then did you continue in your career, or?
No, I didn't. I could have still stayed at IIE, but in a different department. But at that point, my husband was a little freer to do things, and had some business connections in Connecticut, and he preferred that I not work.
Yeah,
so.
That's great. And tell us anything more about your experiences in New York, or any sort of areas maybe in which you volunteered or been involved. I think you said in singing, and tell us what else has been in your life.
Well, you know, kind of different patterns, I think, and I can relate it to a lot of women in the era that I grew up, that maybe didn't have the opportunities for certain things. I still stayed in touch with IIE. I worked with their volunteer group, and because they handled all the Fulbrights, and we would have a program for the Fulbright scholars in the area, and at one point I was acting head of that volunteer group, and my husband and I for 3 years were host families to students, Fulbright scholars over here, and loved doing that as well. So
that's great.
So that's part of the volunteer work.
Yeah.
I took singing lessons.
You mentioned that.
Did, but more not in the classical leader, more in the Jacques Brel and the Sondheim and so forth, and did a couple of showcases. So I loved doing that. My husband and his family had a little marina in Connecticut, so we were there practically every weekend. It was for the small boat owner. Loved doing that.
Oh, that's great.
And he had retired early from government service, had been an FBI agent during part of World War II, before he went into the Navy. And we were active in the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI.
Yeah.
And one year he was national president of the
Oh,
8,000 member organization. So we did a lot of traveling with that, and made wonderful friends.
Great.
And then he died young in 1986, and I've pursued another kind of being back in New York, you know, with friends and with volunteer work in my church and
absolutely
singing in a choir, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and then tomorrow you're having a party here, right? For
yes,
in memory of one of the famous opera singers. Exactly. So that's wonderful. Well, yeah, no, that's great. And sort of thinking back now on the various things you've done in your jobs and your volunteer work in your life, tell us a little bit, maybe the students today at SAIS, what advice you might have for them.
Do you know what? They would probably have advice for me, you know, because it is so much more varied. And I understand the student body comes from lots of different professions, whereas when I was there, I was about 6 years older than most of the classmates, because they had come right from college. And I had gone on and taught school for that number of years after college. But I would say, looking back, and this is something a number of us have reflected on, that women didn't have the same, probably, opportunities then. So this is not detracted from my life whatsoever. I feel I've had a wonderful life, and a wonderfully varied one. But when I had my 50th college reunion from Carleton, and one of our panels, we were discussing things that women didn't have, you know, how we've kind of navigated that. And I mentioned the comment that was made when I took the Foreign Service oral exam, and I said, but then you put it in perspective that we've now had 3 secretaries of state, and the first Secretary of State graduated from SAIS in 1963. So Madeleine Albright was there when we all were.
Yeah,
so,
that's great.
But that's one thing, and I remember also one of my friends in the class ahead of me, and she was a very good scholar, went with a bank, ended up in New York with Chase Bank. But at that point, Chase was not sending women abroad to any of their branches. Citibank did. It was ahead of them. But the opportunities were not just there. And a friend with whom I worked at IIE was a lawyer, and we discussed not too long ago, she was about my age, what her opportunities were. She had come out of Cornell, and I said, well, how many women were in your law school? 2 out of 100. She was on law review. But they told her, you know, when the firms come from New York, they don't want somebody who's a woman. So for a long time, she did other things, eventually landed up in corporate law in the city. But so I think today it's wide open for both men and women to
which is
pursue.
great, yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This was a fabulous little interview, and nice to know more about your life. And thanks for all you do and have done for SAIS in the world.
And if any of my classmates see this, hi.
That's great.